I want to emphasize that, when I speak about the end of the era of Western domination of world history, which is what we are seeing, we're not seeing the end of the West. The West will still remain a strong and powerful civilization, very strong, very powerful. It has tremendous amount of resources, and the combined West still has a majority share almost of the global economy. So you cannot write them off. But at the same time, if you look at the trend lines, is the West becoming more powerful in general or less powerful in general? There's no question that the West is becoming less powerful. Its share of the global GNP is shrinking. And just to give you one statistic that would astonish your listeners, I come from Southeast Asia, and our regional organization is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The combined GNP of the ASEAN region is about 3.5 to 4 trillion, whereas the European Union is 5 times bigger at 17.5, 18 trillion. And yet, despite the fact that the European Union is much bigger than ASEAN, ASEAN added more to global economic growth in the decade 2010 to 2020 than the European Union did. This is amazing. Our economy is 1/5 the size. We added more to global economic growth. But it's a sign of how Europe, in a sense, is declining. Now, the American economy is not declining. The American economy still remains very strong and powerful. But as we all know, American society is a deeply troubled place now. Again, in my book, Has China Won, in chapter 7, I describe how the United States has functionally become a plutocracy. And, when you're a plutocracy where all the benefits of development go to the top 1% or top 0.1%, and the bottom 50% have not seen any improvement in the standard of living for several decades now, something has gone wrong with the society. And that explains, by the way, and I'm sure we'll discuss it later, why the people of America voted for a populist president like Donald Trump, because they want a president who attacks the elites of America, who they feel have let them down. So clearly, as you can see, the two pillars of the West are the European Union and the United States, and both are struggling in many serious ways with the way forward. So I don't see in any way Western domination of world history returning in any way. Now, of course, the other big problem, which I hope we'll discuss, is that there are ways and means of managing the end of Western domination. The West could do it in wiser ways by learning to share power with other parts of the world. But this is something that the West is unable to do. And this is not a wild claim, because, I can tell you, for example, after the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, at the G20 meeting, the Western countries agreed that future heads of IMF and World Bank will be selected on the basis of merit, not on the basis of nationality. And that was incidentally 17 or 18 years ago. And guess what? Nothing has changed. They still insist that the head of the World Bank must be an American, the head of the IMF must be European. This is just an example of the Western reluctance to share power with the rest of the world. And that's why I think it's very important for the rest of the world to try and educate the West on how to manage this transition. And I always emphasize, I'm not an enemy of the West. I'm not trying to bring down the West. I'm trying to guide the West towards a wiser way of managing its relative decline in the world. Well, one of the single biggest change that has happened to our global order over the last 3-4 decades has been the re-emergence of China as a great power. That's the single biggest change that's happened in the world. And there's something remarkable about the way that China has emerged that most people are not aware of, including people in the West. traditionally, when great powers emerge, as they become stronger, they immediately try to flex their military muscles and launch wars and conquer other territories. That's how it's happened. In fact, the man who pointed this out is a Harvard professor whom I know well, Professor Graham Allison. And, in his book called Destined for War, and I cite him in my book as China One, he says that Americans often wish that China could be like America. And he tells his fellow Americans, be careful what you wish for. He says, when we Americans, when we became powerful, sometime in the 1890s is when the United States emerged as the number one power in the world. He said, what do? We immediately declared war on Spain. We conquered Philippines. We conquered Cuba. We seized territories. We had wars. He says, that's what all great powers do. And he says, fortunately, China is not behaving like the United States is behaving when it emerges as a great power. So it's amazing that China hasn't fought a major war since 1979, when it had a major war with Vietnam at the Sino-Vietnamese border. That's 46 years. I mean, there have been skirmishes, there have been, accidents at the sea and so on and so forth, but there has been no major war. And that's remarkable for a great power to emerge in the way that China has without fighting a major war. And this is something that we should be welcoming. And therefore, the rest of the world should be working with China to try and accommodate China in this new global order and therefore have a more peaceful outcome. Unfortunately, the people in both United States and Europe are not managing the return of China intelligently and well. United States is still trying to stop the rise of China, even though, as I've argued in my book, as China One, it cannot be done, it will not succeed. And sure, you've seen in all the efforts the United States has made to stop China's technological development have failed, right? And China has become, continued to grow and develop. Similarly, the Europeans also have not been able to manage the return of China. And as a result of which, relations within Europe and China are also not very good. And it's an example of lack of Western wisdom in managing the return of a great power. Southeast Asia, we have a regional organization called ASEAN. And ASEAN was established in 1967, 8th August 1967, as a pro-American organization. Now, and sure, clearly, and it has grown and succeeded over the years. So with the rise of China, you should have seen, and by the way, when ASEAN was created, both the Moscow and Beijing condemned the creation of ASEAN. So with the rise of China, you should have seen a lot of discomfort between ASEAN and China. But instead, you've seen a very positive relationship that has developed within the pro-American ASEAN and China. And why is that the case? Because I think the Chinese, one thing about the Chinese that most people don't understand and appreciate enough is that they're always long-term thinkers. They're always planning for what the world will be like 2 or 3 decades later and how you adjust to it. And I give you a concrete example. This is in the year 2001, right? 24 years ago, right? And China was still not a major economy at that point in time. In fact, the US economy at that time was 8 times bigger than China's economy in 2001. And, what was surprising is that way back then, China became the first country in the world to propose a free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries. Now, that's actually quite shocking because ASEAN's best friends were United States, then Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But none of these countries proposed a free trade agreement to ASEAN. The first country to do so was China. And that was a brilliant preemptive strike by China against any American containment policy. Because as a result of that, I can give you some statistics. In the year 2001, US trade with ASEAN was $135 billion, and which was 3 times bigger than China's trade with ASEAN, which was only $40 billion. So US 135, China was 40 billion in the year 2001. But by 2022, 2 decades later, as a result of the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, even though US trade with ASEAN went up significantly from 135 billion to $500 billion, China's trade with ASEAN went from 40 billion to $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. Now you can see, therefore, that the Chinese thought long-term and say, where do we want to be with our neighbors in ASEAN 20 years down the road? And sure enough, they wanted to see a strong, flourishing trading relationship. And the trading relationship has meant that the ASEAN countries have not joined a containment policy against China. In fact, while they still have very good ties with the United States, they also have very good ties with China. And this is generally the policy of all the ASEAN countries. Of course, there are ups and downs and some specific problems. In the case of the Philippines, for example, Philippines has some issues with China over some shoals and reefs in the South China Sea. But I think in overall, Philippines still tries to follow the ASEAN policy of maintaining some degree of close ties with China.